This year is the bicentenary of the Luddite uprisings in the north of England, and Rana Mitter chairs a panel of guests now to debate the meaning of Luddism in the 19th century and in the 21st.
Hello and welcome. Do you ever get that feeling that technology may not be our salvation, but our destruction? Would the current financial crisis be as severe if we didn't have supercomputers that could whisk trillions of euros round the world in seconds? Does the mass production of everything from chairs to croissants mean that we've lost the skills of craftsmanship that took generations to build up? Well, that's a viewpoint that would have found a lot of sympathisers exactly 200 years ago, when a group of skilled workers broke into a mill in Nottingham and smashed up the machinery. Those men and women became known as the Luddites. Their name has come down to us as a byword for technological incompetence or backwardness. I speak as someone myself with a mobile phone that dates from 2006, but in fact the real Luddites were a lot more complex and a lot more interesting. They didn't smash machines because they hated the new technology, but because they feared it would rob skilled workers of their jobs. Well, to tell us more about the mill smashers of 2 centuries ago and show us why their message might be worth hearing again today, I'm joined by Katrina Navikas, lecturer in history at the University of Hertfordshire, Andrew Sims, fellow of the New Economics Foundation, and Bill Thompson, BBC technology correspondent. Will you please use your hands in the most old-fashioned way possible to welcome them here today? So, Bill, we're thinking about the Luddites 200 years after they first went into those mills, a little south of here in Nottinghamshire. Do you admire what the Luddites did?
I'm not sure I admire what they did in terms of the violence to property and to people, but I admire the sophistication of their understanding of the situation they found themselves in, that they realised that the technologies that were being deployed at the time, that were coming into operation, were completely changing the environment within which they were expected to make a living, and that those technologies contributed to political changes, and they saw that they would be disadvantaged. So they had a sound analysis. They then tried to do something about it, which was not particularly successful, and I'm not sure was particularly the right way to go about it.
I mean, Andrew, you work for a foundation that's very keen, amongst other things, on what you call appropriate technology. Would you have been a machine breaker 200 years ago? Would that have been the appropriate thing to do to that technology?
I think sitting from the comfortable position of a society in which your basic needs are met, even if you don't have a job, it's very hard to look back and be judgmental. I think if I'd found myself in their situation, when losing your job, losing your livelihood, becoming destitute could be a rapid path to an early death, I think I might very well have found myself of a similar sort of outlook. And it's fascinating to see how nuanced they were. The fact that they would go into a machine room and break some machines and not others. And the ones they would target were the ones that they considered to be hurtful toward the commonality. And I think their experience gives us one big question we must ask about technology, or perhaps an insight into it. And that is that technology should always be a choice, not an ultimatum.
Well, a stark message there that obviously has some resonance for our present-day situation as well as the past. But, Katrina, you're a historian. You specialise in this particular period, and you're also a social historian. Does that give you empathy with the Luddites?
I'm trying to be objective, but what I do admire about the Luddites is their sense of community, that they do represent local communities which feel that something will be lost by the imposition of technology and an imposition of a more national, if not international, economic system. So, as Bill said, the nuanced awareness of economics by the Luddites and the wider community is something that perhaps we don't know about enough.
And not knowing enough about the Luddites has been one of the problems in assessing who they were and what their legacy has been. So, Katrina, I wonder if we could stay with you. Could you just give us a concise but helpful guide to who the Luddites actually were?
There's 3 types of Luddites. In the Midlands, we've got stocking weavers who were fearing that machines would take away their business. We've got northwestern Luddites who are in the cotton industry, who are fearing power looms and these big steam machines that will weave cloth for them. And we've also got Yorkshire Luddites, who generally are woolen workers, who are fearing these shearing machines which shear the cloth. And so they're artisanal workers, they're skilled, they're not a proletariat or the very poor, they're people with skills to defend.
And we're talking now about the outbreak of the mill smashing in Nottingham, really, as the kind of moment that starts the Luddite movement 200 years ago. What was special about that place and time? Why did it start there?
The first Luddite outbreak was actually in 1779 in Nottingham, which is where the term comes from, because apparently there was a man called Ned Ludd. So they took that on in 1811 with the imposition of a new type of stocking machine that would weave stockings in a quicker fashion, but also in a quality that was not the type of quality that skilled workers would aspire to. So one of the things I think that we must know about Luddites is that they're not just complaining about the removal of jobs, they're actually complaining about the lesser quality of the product that these machines are making.
But let's get a picture of who these people are. I mean, these are quite colourful characters, aren't they? They gather at night, they kind of appear out of nowhere from the moors. I mean, these are guys with tactics.
They're very organised. They're not just reactionary people who are creating riots on spec. Luddism is part of a wider trade union movement. Now, trade unions are banned in 1799, and so organised workers have to find different ways of acting against their grievances. So you might have seen a picture of a Luddite, a big sort of burly man in a dress, because men dressing up as women was part of a local custom to represent a sort of world turned upside down carnival.
Is this a Nottinghamshire speciality?
It seems to be a northern one, actually.
Oh,
so
right.
the transvestitism of custom seems to be from the northwest, actually.
Well, that's something I'm sure we'll explore with our audience a little later on here in Gateshead. So clearly a very colourful set of characters. I mean, Bill, obviously you work in a more contemporary sort of area, but do these historical parallels bring some things to mind for you?
They do, because it's about asserting control. It's about people who have a set of skills and who make a living out of that and who appreciate the value of what they produce, seeing that value taken away by automation. And the parallels, obviously, between computerisation and what's happened with the attempts to have paperless offices to the way that certain skills in secretarial skills or indeed in knowledge skills now are increasingly being taken over by the machines makes a clear parallel.
Now, Andrew, as an economist, I'd like you to pick up that term value that Bill used there, because actually this is about a different way in which different types of input into production are dealt with. And ultimately, there is an economic question behind the exciting details of the mysterious appearances on the moorlands and the cross-dressing.
I mean, value is itself a contested term, even in economics, and what you measure determines what gets valued, and the quality of artisanal craft, the network of social relations that it brought, the way it bound communities together. These were things that even in our sophisticated modern times we are very sort of ineffective at assessing and valuing and measuring and therefore determining the overall benefits of different ways of doing things. And I think what's quite interesting from a modern perspective looking back at this, if you look at we're all supposed to be moving towards a green economy, a low-carbon economy, and some of the core characteristics of that, about repairing, reducing, reusing, recycling, are much more to do with getting your hands back on stuff again, learning how to mend, how to repair, how to keep things going. This, coupled with the sort of background in the economy of, on the one hand, high levels of unemployment and other people working much too hard, us speeding up to work at the pace of technology, I think there's lots of things which are pointing towards an appetite for people to rediscover the authenticity of artisanal work and the quality of life that comes with it. And that doesn't necessarily mean parachuting yourself back into a time where you didn't have the benefits of much modern technology, but I think there is probably a sense in which the pendulum has probably swung a bit too far.
But back in the 18th century, Katrina, or the beginning of the 19th century, these were not entirely new protests. I mean, they were part of a wider set of economic changes at that time, weren't they?
Certainly. Well, this is the period when we see the influence of Adam Smith creeping in. So the manufacturers are reading their Wealth of Nations and realising that free trade and fewer protections on industry would be a good thing. So part of the protests are about defending protection, defending workers' rights against free trade Smithian economics, that sort of political system. What the Luddites are also protesting about is the fact that the government seems to be colluding with manufacturers. That they're repealing all these statutes which had protected workers' rights. There's a growing campaign for a minimum wage, and the petitions to Parliament get rejected in 1808. So it's much wider political economy that the Luddites are realising is affecting their individual lives and they're protesting against.
I mean, and one of the interesting things, of course, that the unapprenticed workers who were partly being thrown into the workplace in competition with the former skilled artisans, a lot of them have been displaced by the enclosures. And I think what's interesting
Just explain, this is where people essentially are sent off the land that they had used as common land.
Exactly so. And what's interesting is that you see in this, and it's something you still see around the world today, that technology is never neutral. It always carries with it a kind of DNA for the wider economy and society. And that is determined by who sort of owns and controls the technology, who gets to decide how the benefits of it being used are shared out. And that's why, for example, perhaps in a similar echo in the modern world of the Luddites, you get the movement of the landless in Brazil, who put themselves in opposition to GM technology, not because of the fact that it was a technology, but because the pattern of intellectual property rights around the technology meant that the distribution of benefits from the rural economy were concentrated ever more into ever fewer hands, in a circumstance in which there's already very high levels of wealth inequality.
I mean, the parallels there with the modern world really are astounding. We will come back to some of those. I want to make sure we just get to the heart of the story 200 years ago. And you mentioned the government, Katrina. What was their response to this sudden outbreak of surprising uprisings and mill smashings and machinery destruction?
They passed an act to make it a capital offence to break machines. Workers get shot during the risings. We have about 50 or so people tried, and most of them either get sent off to Australia or get hanged. So I think there's about 30 people get hanged for this offence. So it's a serious reaction against this attacks on property.
And yet they do get some rather interesting support, including the celebrity support of Lord Byron, no less.
We're in a period of romanticism, and there are these flamboyant characters like Lord Byron, Henry Broome, who's another sort of romantic MP. So they feel that going back to the land might be a good thing, is in their romantic view of the landscape. But they don't get very far with all the other parliamentarians, I'm afraid.
And just to be clear, historically, to be a Luddite does not mean to be anti-technology per se. I mean, I think that's what Andrew was saying.
Not at all. These workers are working within a capitalist system. They are using technology. They're not advocating going back to the land and becoming peasants. They're actually defending their industrial skills. What they're opposing is generally removal of protection on their rights as workers.
Paradoxically, can we say then that even the Luddites weren't actually Luddites?
I think we can say that very paradoxically. And in fact, they're part of a much wider strain because if you think about this whole period, I mean, think about something like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, which was written at about the same sort of time. It also expresses this sort of fear, I mean, the promise, but also the fear of technology in a literary sort of way.
But then we're always expressing fears of the new and the novel. It's just that the technological fear is one that becomes more apparent because the enormous social and political change that happened as a result, it did change the lives of everyone. You were right to be afraid of it. It transformed the world. It turned the world upside down. This was not just something relatively small scale. It was something which resulted in industrialisation, which has led to where we are now. It is not unreasonable to be worried about it.
I think at the heart of the ambivalence that we feel about many new technologies coming through is the lived experience that, as you say, there are always unintended consequences from technologies. There are always emergent properties. And I'm reminded of someone who was an absolute techno freak, very important in the history of this nation, Winston Churchill. He was obsessed with science, but he always said that the scientists should be on tap and not on top. And he said that, things that come in on the gleaming wings of science may bring immeasurable blessings, but they can also bring total destruction. So I think there are good reasons why we have a sort of a healthy ambivalence.
Hey, Katrina, from a historian's point of view and with, that longer perspective, what did the Luddites actually achieve? Did they achieve anything, or were they essentially a last cry against an inevitable tide of history?
Well, we see machine breaking continue in the 19th century, so they're not the last wave of machine breaking. I think they did raise awareness about the problems of workers losing their rights